So tonight we're starting a new series. It's on sex. No, it's not. We were just there last week, okay? Tonight is on the fruit of the Spirit. We're starting a new series. We're going through the fruit of the Spirit. Each night we're going to be hitting a different fruit. These are our awesome slides given by Jake Goings, who I consistently take credit from. But each week we'll be talking about a different fruit. And tonight, specifically, we're talking about love. The fruit of the Spirit, for those of you guys who know your verses, as you guys would know, it comes from Galatians chapter 5. Two verses where the fruits are mentioned are verses 22 and verse 23. I'll read them out for you guys. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. This series first hit as I was listening to Pastor talk about some other topic, and he mentioned how he had never once heard a sermon on gentleness. And I remember thinking, man, I don't know that I've heard a whole sermon on gentleness either, and that sparked this idea of preaching through the fruit of the Spirit, and I've been pondering this for the last 4 or 5 years, so I'm really, really excited about this series. So as I said, throughout each Wednesday night, we're going to be hitting a different fruit. Tonight, we're starting on love. But this series was uniquely placed after our sex and sexuality series that we just spent the last month studying. I thought it was so cool the way that God orchestrated these two series to be so similar in a lot of ways, or to transition well from one to the other. Because as you listen to Bob and Kyle, our guest teachers who talked about sex and sexuality, speak over the last month, right? You didn't hear them specifically or only talking about same-sex attraction. You didn't hear them emphasizing just the sexual addictions that a lot of us wrestle with. They didn't focus on the behavioral modification. The message of Bob and Kyle that when they came and spoke over the last month had everything to do with desiring God. It had everything to do with how do we desire God? How do I want God, and why we don't desire God? That was a big question that we answered during our night of worship, is what is keeping you from wanting God? What is keeping you from desiring God? And so as we look back at that series that we just finished on how to want God, how to desire God, it's awesome that we're now transitioning to a new series that talks about the battle between the desires of the flesh and the desires of the Spirit. So before I start, as we go through our series on the fruit of the Spirit, I want to start the same way Paul did. I want to introduce this series by creating a connection in your minds between the fruit of the Spirit and the desires of the flesh. And I'm doing this because that's exactly what Paul does before he lists these 9 fruits. When you look at the verses just before the fruit, right, Paul is creating a connection in your minds between the desires of the flesh and the desires of the Spirit, right? And this connection he gives in the form of a contrast, which you guys know, right? A comparison is taking two things that are similar and asking the question, how are they similar? A contrast is taking two things that are opposite, two things that are dissimilar, and saying, how are they dissimilar? And that's exactly what Paul does. He creates a contrast between the desires of the flesh, what our flesh wants, and what the Spirit wants. And he does this in verse 16 and 17, just 3 or 5 verses right before the fruit of the Spirit. He says this, "But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you won't gratify the desires of the flesh." He then says, for the desires of the flesh are against the desires of the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the desires of the flesh. He says, for these are opposed to each other. They're against each other to keep you from doing the things that you want to do. So are you guys getting the contrast? That if you walk by the Spirit, what you're living, what you're walking in is going to be opposed to the flesh. But if you walk by the flesh, what you're doing, the actions, the behaviors, the heart, is going to be against the desires of the Spirit. And the reason why is because they're against each other. They're opposed to each other. They're opposites to each other. If you're satisfying the desires of the flesh, then you know you're not walking in the Spirit, and vice versa. And I think although we get this idea conceptually, it makes sense, and we talk about it mathematically, logically, it all makes sense. In practicality, when we live our lives, it's very evident that a lot of us think that we can walk in the Spirit while also kind of dabbling in the flesh over here, right? We think that we can overall be pursuing God and doing good things and living a good life, but then every once in a while kind of hang out with our flesh, right? And be obedient to the desires of our flesh. But the way that Paul describes it here in Galatians is that you're either walking in one or you're walking in the other. You can't be doing both. You can't say that you're a Christian, follow Christ, be walking in the flesh, but then have poor language or interact with people in a way that's negative or hate others or not reflect the fruit that we're about to be talking about over the next several weeks. The Greek word for against is this word kata, and it has this idea of hostility. When we talk about the desires of the flesh being against the desires of the Spirit, we're not talking like your little sister where you're like, okay, I like her, she's super annoying, but, I love her at the end of the day type of thing. It's not like that. There's like a battle going on between the desires of the flesh, what our flesh wants us to do, and what the Spirit wants us to do. Peter also talks about this same battle in 1 Peter, and he says the desires wage war against your soul. Your desires wage war against your soul, so it's violent. There is a war going on between these two desires. And I mentioned to the boys when we went upstairs, I talked to them about how a lot of us just need to make that distinction as we're battling our sexual tendencies, our sexual desires, right? A lot of us just need to recognize that there's a battle between our soul and our flesh. And we can separate the two. We can easily distinguish, man, God is pushing me this way, but I can feel my flesh pulling me this way, right? So this is important as we talk about this series. It's important for us to understand because many of us read the fruit of the Spirit as a list of character traits that we're supposed to be better at, right? We read this fruit and we're like, man, I need to be better at being good. I need to be a kinder person. Love, man, that's what I'm slacking on. And we think this is a list of things that should be applied to us but don't apply to us, and we need to work harder at being better at reflecting the fruit of the Spirit. But as I've studied this list this last week, it's been very apparent that Paul is not trying to give us a list of things that we're supposed to be doing better at. Instead, he's giving you a contrast of what your life will look like when you desire and walk in the flesh versus desiring and walking in the Spirit. Just like a huge amount of our application from the Sex and Sexuality series, the application for this series has everything to do with your heart and not everything to do with your behavior. So as I said, the first fruit that we're looking at is the fruit of love. And I'm not oblivious to this idea as we talk about love, right? I could preach on this till you guys graduate high school. People talk about the Bible like it's one big love story, right? And so if that's true, and love is hinted at contextually dozens of times, thousands of times throughout the canon of the Bible, right? That means we could be here talking about love all night. But instead, I'm going to talk about it I guess like for the next 4 minutes, and you'll be set to go on all things love. We're late. We got this. Okay, we can do this. The two things we're going to talk about with regards to love, the first one is our love for God, and the second one is our love for others. And the reason why we're talking about specifically these two things is when you think about the fruit of the Spirit is something that comes out of us as a result of what God's done for us. So although we could talk about God's love for us, that wouldn't really be applicable to what Paul is specifically talking about here in Galatians. The other reason why we're talking about these two things is because as you look through the entire biblical canon, there are only 3 commandments that have to do with love in the Bible. What are they? Who can shout out one of the 3 commandments that have to do with love? Ethan already mentioned it once. Love your neighbor as yourself. What's the second? Yes, which should have been reversed, but we all know that, right? And what's the third one? The third commandment that has to do with love in the Bible is to love the foreigners. Should have raised your hand. So, we're going to start with our love for God. The reason why is because we must start with our love for God before we talk about loving others. And the reason why is given clearly in Peter's life. Throughout Peter's life, you remember as Jesus was dying, Peter kind of messed up 3 times right before Jesus hit the cross, right? Well, after Jesus came back, Jesus died on the cross. He was buried. He was raised to life, right? He went up into heaven. He came back to earth, and he appeared to several people while he was on the earth again, after his death again. One of the people he appeared to was Peter. And he had an interaction with Peter that seemed to be a pivot point for his entire life, for all of Peter's life. When Jesus interacted with Peter after his death, he asked Peter 3 times the same question. Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you truly love me? Do you truly love me, Peter? Each time Jesus asked this to Peter, Peter responded, yes, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. But what's interesting about this interaction is that after Peter says that, each time Jesus responds, then feed my lambs, then take care of my sheep, then feed my sheep. Before Jesus asks Peter to love on others and to take care of the church, Jesus doesn't ask him, do you love the sheep? Jesus doesn't ask Peter, do you love others? Jesus asks Peter, do you love me? And if you love me, then love others. The rest of Peter's life we see him throughout the book of Acts take care of so many people and love others so well. He takes care of many churches. He ministers to many people. He shares the gospel. So many people who don't know the Lord. And it's awesome to see the way that all of Peter's actions reflected the fact that he loved Jesus. And when we talk about our love for God, it leads to a love for others. It's not out of our love for others that we serve others. It's out of our love for God that we love and we serve others. And a lot of us miss this. I see this a lot on missions trips. I used to work for a missions organization over one summer, and it was amazing how many people had this interesting perspective of missions, that it's a do-goodness. I want to love others, I want to serve others. And there was a stark difference between the people who served others just because they loved others and the people who loved God so much. And it was a result of that love that they had for Jesus that they loved other people. So then the question is, how do I love God? What does that look like? And I can't explain, the Spirit works in a lot of different ways as I'm writing these sermons, but for whatever reason, over the last 2 weeks as I've been thinking about this sermon, there's something that really stood out to me as I was thinking about what does it mean to love God and how do we love God. And what was standing out to me as I was thinking about it was that if you truly want intimate love with God, if you truly want to be intimate with the Lord, you need solitude with Him. It's a core ingredient to our love for and of God. And when you think about it in terms of friendships, right? You think of the guys in your small group, right? There's something awesome about getting away from this big group and getting into your small group, right? And even more so if you go from that small group of guys in your group to going out and playing frisbee golf with somebody or shooting hoops with somebody or taking one of your friends out for coffee, getting to know them at a place where it's just you and them. If you really love somebody or if you're building love for somebody, you spend time in solitude with them. And I can confidently say in my own life, my own testimony is that, man, when God took people and a busy schedule away from me and I pressed in to solitude with the Lord, those are the times in my life where I've seen Him eradicate my love for Him. When I just took time out of my life and stepped into solitude with the Lord. Not a super pastoral thing to say, but my bachelor party was last weekend. Yeah, not what I was going for. Josh Toth, our worship leader, is my best man at my wedding next Saturday, low-key. And Josh threw out an awesome bachelor party. What we did is we went to see a band, and just raise your hand if you know the band Relient K. Are you serious? What in the world? Okay. Well, Relient K is like my all-time favorite band. They mean the world to me. It's crazy. I was expressing to one of my housemates the other day how much Relient K has, I've just listened to them my whole life. They've been such an interesting influence on my life. And he has a line in one of his songs that has to do with this solitude that we're talking about. The line is, loneliness and solitude are two things not to get confused. The reason why is because I spend my solitude with you. So what he's saying here is that there is a difference for this man between isolation and loneliness and solitude. And the difference is that when we are in solitude, we spend time with Christ. I'm bringing up this quote because I think a lot of us struggle with this idea of solitude. And for a lot of us, lonely or solitude, being alone, is entirely tied to loneliness. For some of us, it goes as far as depression. For some of us, it goes as far as suicidal tendencies, right? self-harm. Because there's this connection that we've built in our minds between the solitude and the loneliness. And the message here that Matt, the writer of this song, is giving to us is that shouldn't be. That when we are alone, when we're in solitude, that should be the time when we can most, openly express our love for the Lord. And through a lot of those times, man, we have the choice to either pursue or acknowledge that solitude where we get to be alone with the Lord or sit in our loneliness. And I'm telling you, it's through those times of solitude that the Lord has eradicated my love for him more than any other season. So now we want to talk about briefly our love for others. What should our love for others look like? If you were to ask somebody on the side of the street, what is love? What does love look like, right? They'd probably describe something that seems a little bit more like a preference, right? Like, I love pizza, or I love my car, or I was about to say I love my mom, but that's probably not a good example. I love the things that can offer me something, right? I love pizza because it tastes good to me. I love my car because it goes fast. It makes me feel cool, right? But that definition of love is so contrary to the way that the Bible defines love. God's definition of love, is so different. God's definition of love, I boiled it down to two things here. The first one is service. Christ's love, the way that God articulates our love for others, is through service. It's not about what the object of my love can do for me, rather what I can do for the object of my love. And if you want to love another person well, that's your desire, you have to learn to put yourself in their shoes. You have to learn to empathize with them. And therefore, the second application, the second thought that's tied to our love for others is that it takes practice. It takes practice to be able to do that. Brooke, my fiance, she is celiac. And for those of you guys who don't know, it's like being gluten-free, but it's deadly. Basically, if you're celiac, you're gluten-free, but if you eat gluten, your body will start attacking itself, and people have died from it. So it's a little bit more serious than being gluten-free. Needless to say, last summer, right before last summer was Valentine's Day, February, right? I was going to get Brooke something fancy, but I was buying her a ring soon enough, so I was like, you know what, she's fine. I'll buy something small, and she'll like the ring later. That's cool. Neither one of us are rich. We're fine, And so I was like, what do I get her? Got to figure it out. But obviously the classic move is chocolate. And so my grandma always told me when I was a kid, if you want to buy a girl's heart, buy it with chocolate, right? So I bought her chocolate, and she was still in college at the time, so I had to ship it to her friend who lived on campus, and then I had to have her friend wrap it with wrapping paper and put a little card on it, because I forgot to write a card, of course. Then she had to put it in my fiance's dorm and set it there in a way that Brooke had no idea how it appeared there. It just kind of happened, And so that whole thing happened. It was a big fiasco, and she opened it up, looked at the ingredients, and the first thing she saw was that it had gluten in it. So learning to love somebody, especially someone who's celiac, takes time. It takes practice. It takes learning what other people genuinely want, right? That's what Paul talks about in Philippians when he says to think of the interests of others as well as the interests of your own, right? So loving other people takes practice. Godly love is selfless, and godly love takes time to learn. All right, I'm going to close out, but real quick, I just want to hit one more thing before we leave. Do you guys remember the 3 commandments about love, right? The first one was to love the Lord, and the second was love your neighbor. The third was love the foreigners. I'm bringing this up to you guys again because I want to present to you the idea that loving the foreigners has absolutely everything to do with what you do here on a Wednesday night. Loving the foreigners has everything to do with what you do here on a Wednesday night. Your involvement here at the Mix should strike up that idea of loving the foreigner. When you're over here shooting hoops, and there's someone over there on those back couches sitting by themselves, for you to stop playing basketball and to go talk with that person is loving the foreigners. When a new person shows up in your small group, for some of you guys, y'all got new people in your small group tonight, for you to intentionally ask that person what their name is, ask them what their life is like. That's what it means to love the foreigners. It's so important for us as a church, Big C Church, to love the foreigners. I have to say that many, many times as I've brought new students in, some of you guys have been so good at loving the foreigners. I can't tell you how many times I've trying to get somebody through the new student application form, and one of you guys is so excited to meet them that you're pulling them away as they're trying to write it, right? Some of you guys have done such a good job, and it's been awesome to see how you guys have loved the foreigners. But there are also times throughout my time here that I've seen students show up, and specifically one time, I was asked not to say this person's name. It was at Connect last summer. A student came to one of the Connects, pulled that student aside, said, "Hey, what's up? What's your name? Blah, blah, blah. Good to meet you," all that stuff. I said, "Hey, we've got the mix starting up in the fall. Do you want to come?" And this person said, "No." And I was like, that's not what I expected. And I asked the student, "Oh, that's a bummer. You busy?" And the student was like, "No, I'm not busy." And I was like, "Oh, why aren't you interested in coming?" And the student was like, "Well, I came last week." And not a single person said hello to me. Not a single person. And I don't know if you guys have moved before or maybe even just personally experienced the loneliness that I'm talking about, but my heart breaks when that happens. And somebody who should come to a place where they should be more welcome than anywhere else feels rejected and ignored and not seen. And I have to emphasize, man, y'all are awesome. And so many of you guys have done a great job. But when we talk about what Christ has done in our life and how different our lives look because of Christ, this ought to change as well. Our love for others, our love for those who are new, our love for those who have moved here, a love for students who you haven't met before. We ought to do better at that. I'm going to close by reading a verse real quick, and then we'll leave. It's John chapter 3, verse 18. It says, "Let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth." Let's pray. God, you have been so gracious to us and so good to us, Lord. You have, as Ethan talked about, come down to the cross, Lord, to love us, to sacrifice your life for us out of a love that is unexplainable, Lord. I don't understand why you died on the cross for me. But God, when I look at your face, I see a God who loves me, a Father who wants me home, a friend who wants to walk beside me as I go through life's trials. And God, I'm thankful for you. Us as a church, Lord, we want to learn to love you. We want to learn what it looks like to reflect your Spirit and the fact that your Spirit lives within us. So God, teach us over this next series, Lord. Would you teach us how to love others? Would you teach us what it looks like to live a life of peace? Would you teach us what it looks like to be a joyful people, Lord? Would you teach us and humble us to look more like you each and every one of these days? We pray all these things in your name, God. Amen.